Um, I think we are almost ready to go. We're going to wait a couple more minutes for people um, to just come into the room, and then I'm going to get started around the 3 minute mark. So we've got about 2 minutes left. So if you're here, just sit tight, and we'll start around the 3 minute mark or whenever Sonny tells me to start. So almost ready to go. Got about 1 minute if you just entered. We're going to be starting in about 1 minute, just allowing time for people to come in because people aren't always punctual. All right. Well, it's 3 minutes on my mind, on my watch. So if it's okay with Sunny, I may start.
Yep,
Um,
that's perfect.
awesome. Well, welcome. My name's Obbie Todd. Thanks for coming to the launch of my new book, The Beechers, America's Most Influential Family. There you go, right there. Didn't they do such a great job on this book? I mean, LSU just knocked it out of the park. This is actually a photo taken by photographer Matthew Brady in 1859. If I can say, just as if anyone is here thinking about publishing a book in Civil War era or transatlantic history, I would just recommend LSU Press. They've just been phenomenal from start to finish. So this is a project that has been in the works for a couple years. Um, but anyway, I kind of wanted to introduce myself. I'm a pastor in Marion, Illinois. I teach adjunctly church history. My research focus is American religious history. So I've always kind of come across the Beechers, but what I wanted to do, what my main goal was for writing this book, was I wanted to be able to tell the story of 19th century America, if I could, through one family. Um, in fact, I think it's really impossible to tell the story of American Christianity in the 1800s without the Beechers. They pop up all the time. They're talking to presidents. They're next door neighbors with Mark Twain. You know, Henry's hanging out with Walt Whitman, giving his thoughts about Calvinism to Ralph Waldo Emerson. Um, you got Isabella, who's in the women's rights movement. They're kind of like the Forrest Gump of 19th century America. They just kind of pop up all the time at some of the most critical moments in American history. And so this work is far more than a biography. It's also kind of a 10,000 foot view of what's going on in the United States in the 19th century. And of course, if you know anything about U.S. history, you know that you not only not have the Civil War, but you have the Gilded Age, you have the kind of the beginning of the Progressive Era. So there's just a ton happening there, and the Beechers are there all the time. And so Mark Knoll, who wrote the foreword, kind enough to write the foreword, and it was a fantastic foreword. He writes this in his foreword. He says, I might have it here. He says, "What a story! The family's history did not reflect the nation's history perfectly or completely, but no other American clan came even close." They really are, and as I try to contend in the book, I really do think you could compare um, them to some other really famous families like the Adamses, the Harrisons. But I do contend, it's not my overarching goal in the book, but I do contend that they may very well be the most influential family um, in the country during that century, not politically, but because they're so powerful in the realm of moral and social reform. You know, you have abolitionists, you have suffragists, you have women's rights advocates, you have Native American rights advocates, you have Henry Ward Beecher, who is a mega church pastor and really one of the most powerful voices in Brooklyn and New York City for his age. You have college presidents, you have education reformers. They really are taking the revivalism of the Second Great Awakening, if you will, and kind of packaging it for all the new moral and social issues that come their way. And so I start with Lyman Beecher. I was fortunate enough to have the book endorsed by Joan Hedrick. She won the Pulitzer Prize for her biography of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and I was really delighted to see that she kind of understood what I was doing. I really wanted to start with Lyman Beecher, the patriarch, the father, and really start with him because I felt like that he has been a figure in American religious studies who's often been stereotyped. I wanted to give a more robust, rounded view of him. And something that I think a lot of people don't realize is that Lyman Beecher was born 9 months before the Declaration of Independence. So he was born in 1775. And then he died 9 days after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. So that means Lyman Beecher's life spans what we know today as the early republic almost perfectly. So it's a fantastic starting point to tell the story of the early United States and American evangelicalism. Lyman Beecher's story does touch. Of course, he is a Northerner. He doesn't really go to the South much. He does go to Kentucky at times. But if you want to look at what's happening in American religion, Protestant American religion, you have to really take into account his life. And so that's really where my starting point was. Lyman was a famous revivalist and an education reformer. In fact, he was probably, other than Charles Finney, he was probably the most famous revivalist for his era. And so he was the leading advocate. I'd say most people during their lifetime knew him as the leading advocate for temperance. Basically, if there's anyone in America who hated drunkenness, it was Lyman Beecher, and he kind of pounded that into his kids. One scholar has called Lyman Beecher the commander in chief of the Second Great Awakening. That was one of my favorites. And he really was. He devoted his entire life to revivalism and reform. I wanted to quote this is a pastor writing to Lyman Beecher from New York City to Boston. And he says this: "You are wanted in Boston, I know. And where are you not wanted? The Bible Society, the Tract Society, the Education Society, and above all, the Home Missionary Society. They all want you. You may do a great good in Boston, but could you do as much good the next 4 years of your life anywhere else than in New York?" And so that kind of illustrates how Lyman Beecher was getting asked to pastor churches all over the Eastern Seaboard, and he was always kind of had a hand in starting what we know today as kind of the benevolent empire, this coalition of moral and social causes that were kind of initiated by evangelicals. He co-founded the American Temperance Society. He had a hand in starting the Home Mission Board. And so this was a man who he was not only a revivalist, but he inspired people like William Lloyd Garrison. He actually had a hand in raising up some of the leaders in the American Anti-Slavery Society. Um, he was not and never became a radical abolitionist, but that's kind of why I wrote the book, is because Lyman Beecher was known during his lifetime as a reformer. He pushed the bounds of American religion. He adhered to this new idea called New Haven theology. He put a lot of stock in human ability, and he kind of takes this idea and passes it on to his kids. And this book is pretty much the story of how the Beecher kids are constantly rebelling and pushing back against Lyman's Puritan religion. But they also, in the process, become very much like their father. And that's kind of That's human history in a nutshell. But you can kind of see that the antebellum generation is both a reaction to and a reflection of the revolutionary generation. And I believe that you can see that in the clearest way in this family. And so I think what most scholars have done well is seeing that Lyman's kids were some free thinking kids. Scholars have noted that a lot of the Beecher kids became forerunners and um, pioneers for what we know today as American theological liberalism. But they were also remarkably conservative at the same time. And I think that one of the reasons I wanted to write this book was because there had never really been a true chronological history of this family. There has been one really good biography of the Beecher family, Milton Rugoff. It was over 40 years ago, but Rugoff really has a hard time really grasping a lot of the theological movements of the time. And you cannot understand this family at all unless you understand religion. They were talking about religion all the time. Um, One of the ironies of the family is that even though the Beechers reject their father's conservative religion, they end up becoming very religious people. And so that was one of the more fun aspects of writing this book is I got to delve into American politics, social issues, slavery, big time. But you really can't understand this family at all unless you understand religion because that's kind of what they're talking about or on the dinner table. Um, and so I just kind of wanted to start there. The family story begins in 1832 when, at the height of his fame and the height of his influence, he Lyman Beecher walks away from his pastorate in Boston and basically takes his entire family. He has 11 kids. At the time, he takes nine of them and he takes them to an upstart seminary in Cincinnati, which is at that time the American frontier. And on the frontier, Lyman is convinced that if they do not Christianize or evangelize the frontier, that they're going to lose America. And he kind of passes on this sense of urgency and transformation and evangelism to his kids, and in the process, kind of teaches them how to be moral and social reformers. Um, this book is essentially how moral influence becomes the family business of the Beechers. Somehow, even though his kids almost all reject his religion or his Puritanism or his Calvinism, they end up adopting his overarching project to change the world or change the nation. And so in the process, the Beechers kind of become more or less like the nation's first family of social justice warriors, if you will. They're not held together by doctrine, but they're held together by ideals that Lyman essentially nails into his kids. And so you really can't tell the story of the anti-slavery movement or the women's rights movement or the Native American rights movement. You can't really tell that story unless you see or take into account what the Beechers are doing. Um, all of Lyman's 11 children do extraordinary things. And I made a little list here. Harriet, who is the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, she's the most famous. She becomes an anti-slavery writer. Henry becomes, in Mark Noll's words, the Billy Graham of his era. He's the most famous preacher in America. Some say he's the most famous man in America during the Civil War era. Catherine essentially becomes like the Martha Stewart of 19th century America. She invents home economics, and she actually starts or is a significant player in what eventually becomes Native American rights. She speaks out against Andrew Jackson during the Trail of Tears. Edward becomes a college president. George becomes an agent of the American Anti-Slavery Society. George, a lot of people don't know this, but George was actually probably the most radical on the issue of race. James, the youngest Beecher, leads a black regiment in the Civil War and becomes a missionary in the South China Sea. Both George and James took their own life, and I kind of delve into that in the book. Isabella, who is the youngest daughter, she becomes one of the primary leaders in the women's rights movement. She was the most radical, or the most ultra, I guess you might say, is the language they would have used in the 19th century. She was the most ultra in her beliefs, and yet she has this to say when someone, or when she talks about how she got her views or how she became to be a woman's rights advocate. This is what she has to say. I date my interest in public affairs from those years between 11 and 16, when our family circle was ever in discussion on the vital problems of human existence. Where the United States Constitution, fugitive slave laws, Henry Clay, and the Missouri Compromise alternated with topics like free will, regeneration, heaven, hell, and the destiny of man. So if you could really put yourself in the dinner table of this family, every single night, Lyman Beecher is sitting around the table with his kids talking about politics, theology, social issues. And this becomes a family who really become one of the most religious families in the 19th century. And they also become very politically minded, theologically minded. I think most of us today, we don't want to talk about politics or religion at the dinner table, but the Beechers did. And this was one of the really enjoyable aspects of getting to know this family and getting to read their correspondence and their letters to one another. They're always talking about the latest issues in America, and so it was really easy to be able to tell the story of the United States in part through this one family. Um, and so one thing I wanted to kind of mention, Henry Ward Beecher. A lot of people don't know him today, but he was the most famous pastor in his day. He told Ralph Waldo Emerson once, he said that he did not hold one of the 5 points of Calvinism in a way to satisfy his father. Henry was always kind of pushing back against what he thought was this fossilized, angular, traditional way of thinking about God. He once said, "What is orthodoxy? Well, I will tell you. Orthodoxy is my doxy, and heterodoxy is your doxy. And that is only if your doxy is not like my doxy." And so it was this family that constantly had a love-hate relationship with their Puritan father. And this is an aspect of the Beechers that I'm not sure that had ever really been taken into account, because the Beechers were remarkably conservative and progressive at the very same time. On his wife Roxana's deathbed, Lyman promised his wife that all of his sons would become ministers, and that actually happened. All of his sons became pastors, but one of the remarkable things about this family is that the sisters, Harriet, Catherine, even Mary, who was kind of the more private, they were all actually more theologically astute than the sons. And so, I mean, you cannot read Harriet Beecher Stowe without thinking that this woman is a genius. She understands theology, and she understands it enough that she's able to kind of weave in satire as well. And so I came away with this newfound respect for Harriet Beecher Stowe. And so I kind of get a little bit into that. I talk a lot about Uncle Tom's Cabin. Um, but the Beecher family was united in one thing. They were divided on denominations. Some were Presbyterians, some were Congregationalists. Harriet and Catherine actually become Episcopalian. So that's kind of fun. There's a lot of denominational humor. Religious humor is the best anyway, and you really find that in the Beechers because they're just jam-packed full of personality. But the one thing that kind of this phenomenon that takes place in 19th century America is this thing that people call Beecherism. And I spend a lot of time on that because it's the one thing that people identified as this common thread in their entire family. And so I thought that was interesting, and I wanted to write about it because to a lot of scholars today, the Beechers were very different. They were very individualistic, they were very eclectic, and they were. But to their enemies, they were united. And so I actually I wanted to read this excerpt. It's page 18. This will be from something that I said. In both the North and the South, contemporaries of the Beechers often had a word for their sense of moral superiority and their characteristically bold approach to reform, Beecherism. It was generally not a compliment. Before the Beechers had even arrived in the West, a local pastor was warning Cincinnatians about Beecherism. In the slaveholding South, where Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin was anathematized as a work of the devil, Beecherism was a monster under the bed. Richmond's Southern Literary Messenger, and that's just a newspaper, struggled to define the creature, and this is what the editor had to say. The old proverb, saints, sinners, and Herveys, has of late received a new application, and the citizens of the New World have been designated as good, bad, and Beechers. The latter being supposed to be an intermediate class between the others. And this is how he describes Beecherism. Proprietors of too much genius and goodness to be summarily condemned, and of too much altruism and singularity to be commended, the Beechers defy both natural and artificial methods of classification and can be ranked only in the catalog of American curiosities. As we direct travelers to a hot spring or a mammoth cave, as the peculiarity of American nature, so we point out to him the Beecher family as a freak of American humanity. So he kind of encapsulates this idea that the Beechers were orthodox enough to not be labeled heretics, but they were way too radical for the conservatives. And so even Lyman Beecher's trial, when he's put on trial for heresy, that really is the beginning of what we know today as the Presbyterian Schism of 1837. So the Beechers find themselves at the center of riots, denominational splits. Henry Ward Beecher is at the center of the first sex scandal in American evangelicalism in American history. And so it's this story of a family who is very similar to our own, but yet they are very representative of their own century. I could go more into what was said of the Beechers, but there was one quote, and I'm not going to give the entire quote, but somebody tries to define Beecherism, and he says, Beecherism, this is an enemy, by the way. This is a guy named Orestes Augustus Brownson, who used to be a transcendentalist and became a Catholic. He says, Beecherism jumps astride every popular movement. So essentially, the Beechers were always kind of going along with whatever was popular at the time, or what appears it likely to be a popular movement of the day. Beecherism went in for abolition, I'm quoting here, Negro suffrage, Negro eligibility, and now goes in for Negro equality in all the relations of society, female suffrage and eligibility, and reversing the laws of God so as to make the woman the head of the man, not man the head of the woman. Henry Ward Beecher is at the head of the women's rights movement, so earnestly defended by his lackey at the Independent. Beecherism even goes in for divorce and polygamy and concubinage and free love and free religion. While it retains enough of its original Calvinistic spirit to require the state to take charge of our private morals and determine by statute what we may or may not eat, drink, or wear, when we may go to bed or get up. And so I think the reason I wanted to get that quote there is because a lot of people were fed up with the Beechers because they were always telling other people how to live. And so they really had that kind of Yankee moralistic spirit about them. So they were remarkably conservative and progressive at the same time. Henry Ward Beecher was, of all people, was in for women's rights, but yet he had no truck for the theater. He was a teetotaler almost. And so seeing this family is really seeing what American religion was doing in the 19th century, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to tell it. I wanted us to end with, I did a lot of my research at the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center in Hartford, Connecticut. I owe a lot to Elizabeth Burgess for assisting me. I spent some time there in Connecticut. I also did a lot of digital um, or digitizing of manuscripts from Yale. They were incredibly helpful. Beneke Library was incredibly helpful. I even had some assistance from the Radcliffe Institute in Harvard. And so I owe a lot to my research. It was enjoyable. It was long. But it's my contention in this book that the Beechers were perhaps, possibly, I mean, you can't measure it, but they were possibly the most recognizable family in the United States in the 19th century. When Harriet Beecher Stowe meets Abraham Lincoln, he allegedly says, "So you're the young woman, or you're the little woman who started this great war." And of course, he was referring to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which had kind of ignited the American conscience against slavery. Lincoln was actually well versed in Henry Ward Beecher's sermons. The ladies, the Beecher sisters, they were next door neighbors with Mark Twain. Thomas Beecher actually officiated Twain's wedding. Walt Whitman loved to go hear Henry's sermons. Emerson comes up, Burney comes up, famous editors, Greeley, presidential candidates. I mean, there's everyone that you could think of under the sun that comes in through the Beecher circle. And so there were two or three Beecher sons at Gettysburg. They just show up everywhere. And it was a really fun book to write, and it was one that I try to trace a common thread, and that thread that unites the Beechers, despite their many religious and political differences, is this idea of moral influence that was so popular during that time. Beecherism becomes this kind of self-importance that the entire family has. They believe that they were all essentially appointed by God in some way to change America. And they all do, but in different ways. They didn't always agree, and that's part of the reason I wrote the book, is how they were able to maintain unity as a family, even though they were diverse on so many issues. The only time that the family was actually split was probably during Henry Ward Beecher's sex scandal. There was some disagreements there. Like Isabella wouldn't talk to Henry. She thought he was an adulterer, and he probably was. But then you had Catherine and Harriet who were defending Henry. And so I basically try to chronicle this family, and in so doing, try to tell the story of 19th century America. I'm going to leave it open right now for questions. Sonny is probably going to direct me in how to do that, but I thought I would just kind of briefly introduce the book and leave it open for anyone who did have any questions about the book. And at that point, I can talk a little bit about my next project and some of the research that I'm doing at the moment.
Thank you. Our first question is about what sort of happened to the Beecher family after this period of history. Do you have information on sort of what happened to the next generations and living descendants today?
Yeah, I only go another generation beyond them, but I do. You have to take into account their children, because a lot of their children are equally remarkable. They have like Harriet's son. I kind of tell a lot of his story, not only because he's wounded in the Civil War, but because of his Western travels. He actually is killed in a great battle against the Native Americans in the West. She has a son who takes his own life, or maybe takes his own life. He's never heard of again in San Francisco. You have actually one of the Beecher children becomes a Unitarian minister, which was horrifying to Lyman Beecher because he was the great Unitarian fighter. And then to have a grandson that became a Unitarian is just an irony. Um, and then you have Charles, for instance. I tell the story. Charles actually lost more than one child. He actually lost two children in 1 year. He had a child that drowned, and actually drowned while playing with Edward's children. So I tell a lot of the story of their kids. You have to, because they talk about their kids all the time. that impulse toward family centeredness that Lyman kind of instills in them continues on. Harriet absolutely loved her kids. Um, and even even Mary, Mary Beecher's daughter becomes, or her granddaughter rather, becomes one of the great women's rights advocates in United States history. And so, yes, I do account for a lot of what's happening in the second and third and even fourth generation Beechers. There are a lot of Beechers still today in New England. And I actually emailed, I have to think, I forgot who it was, but I'm pretty sure I exchanged emails with a very, very distant relative, but Beechers are scattered all over the United States, but many of them are still Beechers. But due to the kind of scope of the book, I limited it to third and fourth generation. I didn't get much beyond there. I would probably love to write a little article on fifth, sixth, and seventh generation Beechers, because a lot of them have become influential in their own right. But yeah, I limited it to Lyman's grandkids and at times his great grandkids.
Thank you. We just had a follow-up question on that come in from Paul asking about whether any of the living Beecher descendants are associated with the Beecher Center, and if they sort of have thoughts or feelings that they're outspoken about in terms of growing up with that surname and that heritage.
I can't speak for that. The Harriet Beecher Stowe Center was primarily an archival source for me. So I don't know much about the relationship that the Beecher family currently holds with that center. All I know is that the scope of the archives that they hold for that family in that generation, which is when the Beecher name became what it is really impressive archives. And I mean, I had to stay a lot of hours there to comb through not just Harriet, not just Henry, not just Catherine, but I combed through James's letters, George's letters. That's one thing I thought was a benefit to the book is I actually spend a lot of time with the lesser known brothers, like Charles, like Thomas. And so there are books that have been written, for instance, on Thomas. That was of great help, and there's been articles written on Charles, not much written on James. But that was another reason why the Harriet Beecher Stowe Center was so helpful, was because it was, which is right next to the Mark Twain Center for anyone who knows that. But I can't speak in terms of the descendants today and their relationship to that center at all.
Thank you. We've talked a bit about the Beechers as America's most influential family at the time. Did you come across other families who might have wanted to claim that title and sort of how they would have compared to the Beechers and, in what ways they were similar or different or maybe less influential?
Sure. Um, I think at the time, the 19th century, John Adams dies in 1825, same day as Thomas Jefferson, and on the 50th anniversary, remarkably, of the Declaration of Independence, um, and I guess 1826. And of course, John Quincy becomes a president as well. So I think most people, when they think of presidents, or sorry, when they think of most famous families in the 19th century, they've really got to come full circle with the Adamses. I'm not sure that anyone was clamoring as most influential, um, but I think the Harrisons, President Harrison actually knew Lyman Beecher well. He was a part of a men's society in Cincinnati. Of course, he was lived in just outside of Cincinnati, and so he knew the Beechers well. And so I'd say at that time you've got to really go. I think most people today, when they think of influential families in the 19th century, they think of politics. And I don't think the Beechers thought like that. And I'm not sure 19th century Americans thought like that. That is not to say that politicians are not influential at all. But I would say this. I would say that um, the Rockefeller family. Once by the end of the 19th century, you've got Standard Oil really making a lot of headway, and you've got Junior who's starting to establish the Rockefeller Foundation for what it is. Only then, in the third or fourth generations, do you get Rockefellers who are politicians. And so I guess I use that illustration to say that in the history of America, true moral influence has been exerted less by politics and more by that kind of that stumping for causes. People who are willing to go before a crowd and speak. Some people who kind of channel that inner revivalist. And that was the Beechers. Matter of fact, the Rockefellers. Rockefeller was a Baptist. He had a little bit of that too. But to answer your point or answer your question, Sonny, um, I'd say the Adamses and the Harrisons you've got to really account for, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a whole host of them. But no one was really laying claim to that, and I wouldn't say that the Beechers were even claiming that. But the Beechers had this consistent consciousness that it was their calling by God that they were meant to change America for good. And even when they adopted Victorian views, which they did, unlike their father, they were still revivalists at heart. I would say this, they were kind of evangelists for moral and social reform. And to tell their story is to tell really the legacy of the Second Great Awakening, and how it kind of was transformed into this, um, the moral and social movements that we see later in the 19th century. So, no, no one was trying to claim that, but the Beechers they were self-consciously trying to change America, maybe more than any family really was.
Thank you. Our next question here is from Tamara. Question is, what was the big picture relationship of Beecherism to transcendentalism? It seems like there's a lot of overlap in anti-slavery and social justice, but I'm not sure if any of them ever joined forces.
Oh, they did. They did. Debbie Applegate, who wrote what I think is one of the best biographies that's been written in the last 50 years. She wrote the Pulitzer Prize winning biography of Henry Ward Beecher. She actually called Henry a Christian transcendentalist, which I think is pretty apt. Um, Henry kept very tight circles with a lot of transcendentalists, or several. And of course, transcendentalism itself, as we know, was not a uniform movement. But because the Beechers were Yankees, and because they were living in places like Connecticut, they kept that, in this goes for Harriet as well. This goes for Isabella. Um, there is a lot of overlap. That's Tamara is spot on. I think though transcendentalism religiously tended to be a kind of an anti-establishmentarian Unitarianism. Of course, they kind of looked at those Harvard Unitarians, those elites, as a little more, a little too cozy with the corporations and with the merchants of Boston. But transcendentalism itself was a kind of a Unitarian movement. And I would say that the Beechers always kind of pushed against uh, that type of religion. I think the Beechers were always, and this is something that drove people crazy, but the Beechers were always trying to straddle evangelicalism and what I would deem just heterodox religion. They kind of were they were too evangelical to be dismissed, but they were way too heterodox to be accepted. And so I would to answer that, I would say Henry had a pretty good relationship with Ralph Waldo Emerson. Um, I think Harriet corresponded with some of the woman transcendentalists. I'm not sure if she ever spoke with Alcott or not. Um, and of course, you kind of have outliers like Walt Whitman. So yeah, there's a little bit of some overlap there ideologically because the Beechers are always at the forefront of abolitionism. They're not always there at the same time. Um, and you can't really do anything with New England abolitionism without really touching on transcendentalists. So yes, they did make common cause, but they never identified themselves explicitly as transcendentalists.
Thank you. Our next question is an opportunity for you to, as you mentioned, talk about some of the work that you're doing now, looking forward. So can you tell us about future projects and what you're researching right now?
Sure. Right now, I am under contract with Oxford University Press. I'm writing a religious biography of John D. Rockefeller. That's why I brought up Rockefeller earlier. Um, there have been many books on Rockefeller, most notably Ron Chernow's kind of magisterial work. But Chernow's book is getting older, and specifically, there has never been a book that dealt really in depth with Rockefeller's religion, warts and all. There have been books that kind of hold him up as this kind of, his generous philanthropist and principles for business and what have you. But there's never really been a book written on how this man reconciled his view of corporate takeover and how he reconciled in his mind all the greed and corruption that was clearly in his business with the fact that he was a man who was clearly so generous. I think he is a paradoxical figure, and I'm trying to right now. I'm in the middle of maybe chapter 3 or 4, writing a book that it's tentatively entitled John D. Rockefeller, the Baptist Baron. It's in the Spiritual Lives series in Oxford University Press. The editor is Timothy Larson at Wheaton, and I'm investing a lot of my time in financial history, trying to really learn a lot about trusts, a lot about the oil industry itself, and trying to make sense of this man who loved money and power, and who was accused so much of greed and being a shark, while also a man who clearly did so much good with his money. Right now I'm just trying to delve into what we know today as industrial capitalism and his history, because of course he was a Baptist. He was raised in the what we know today as the burned over district. And so that's been a fun project. That's kind of where I'm at right now.
Thank you. Well, that is our last question, so we can go ahead and say goodbye to our audience.
Well, thank you all for listening to this launch. I hope you buy the book. And on that note, uh, I think there's a link, and Sonny helped me out a little bit. But Sonny has told me that there will be a link provided on the Facebook page, I think, in the comment section, perhaps, linking a 40% off for the book if you'd like to buy it. LSU Press is running a sale right now, 40% off their books. And so if you would like to read the book, and I hope you would. It's very easy to read. I know that I wrote it and it's a little self-promoting, but I wrote this book to be as easy to read as you can. It gets in depth at times into ideas and religion and politics, but I pride myself on being someone who writes clearly and fluidly, and I hope that I've achieved that in this book. It is written for both an intellectual audience and a popular audience. But if it interests you and you would like to read the book, you can get that link here on the page, and or you can just go to LSU Press and see. I think that's right there on the cover. 40% off the Beecher book if you would like to find out more about this family.